Okay, so now we got to shift gears and talk about liability risk control. So what can you do ahead of losses to reduce frequency and severity from liability, which is a much trickier thing to deal with because it's harder to anticipate, it's harder to imagine these losses, and there's a lot of variability where these losses can actually come from. Property, it's easy to imagine where the problems are. You know, you've got fires, you've got floods, you've got windstorm. You can imagine the perils. Liability, you can't really predict. Why is somebody going to sue you and claim that you haven't acted like a reasonable person would have acted, and as a result, they have damages that they think you should pay for? It's hard to predict those kinds of things. And then on top of that, there's no limits to what you can be sued for. So without knowing where the losses can come from, it's much harder to try to talk about, well, what can we do to minimize the possibility that that's going to happen? There's always going to be an element of unpredictable liability that you really can't control. And that's a hard pill to swallow if you're a risk manager. So the trick is, well, we're going to do what we can and take control of what we can and at least reduce the amount of liability that's out there. So one way to think about it, one way to organize our discussion is to say, okay, you've got liability from things that happen on your premises. You have things that happen as a result of operations. And from a risk control perspective, whether it's completed operations or regular operations, that's not really a distinction that matters in terms of trying to reduce the liability from the outset. When you're making an insurance claim, that's going to matter. Remember, they've got separate limits. So I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I am saying in terms of loss control, the distinction is less important. Products liability, so things that you make or things that you sell. How can you reduce the liability that comes from that? There's some specific things you can do, but you're limited also in what you can do. Auto liability, if you've got employees driving vehicles, you have auto liability. And there are some steps you should take to try to reduce that. It has to do with, well, who do you allow to drive your vehicles? Under what circumstances? We'll talk about those. And then workers' comp and employer liability as well. Employer's liability. How can you reduce the possibility of injury? For the number of injuries every time we can prevent something, that results in a savings. The tricky part is we don't really know how much because it's unobservable, right? So we have some loss prevention techniques we can use. Requiring everybody to wear a hard hat in a construction zone, that's a liability risk management technique. If you weren't requiring hard hats in construction zones, somebody gets hurt by falling debris, I guarantee you're going to get sued, and that's going to be the first thing that the attorney on the other side says. How did you let somebody have access to this construction site without a hard hat? So that's a fairly basic example of loss prevention. A loss reduction, so reducing the severity. Remember, loss prevention reduces frequency of losses. Loss reduction is reducing severity of losses. So CPR training for employees, that's actually a loss reduction technique. We aren't going to apply CPR on people randomly. We're only going to do that on people who are experiencing heart trouble, right? So we're trying to keep them alive until we can get medical attention to them, and in that way reduce the possibility if something does happen, somebody decides that we are liable, then maybe we can have saved somebody's life, and that will be ultimately a cost-saving measure, but that's not how we're looking at it. We're looking at this as something that's good for our employees if we can accomplish this somehow. Just like in the property risk control side of things, avoidance usually doesn't work. To truly avoid this liability risk from being in business, that means we have to not be in business. If you don't want premises risk and you want to avoid it, you have to not have a premises. If you're a retailer, that's going to be really hard. I guess you could shift everything online and sell solely online if you want. You'll still have some liability exposure, but you want a premises liability. That's an example of avoidance that you could use. That's pretty extreme. And it's certainly not going to be realistic for all retailers. You think about a grocery store or a local hardware store like we had. Premises liability is something that we have to accept. We'll do what we can to try to limit it through loss prevention and loss reduction kinds of things. We were in southern Minnesota. There's a lot of snow and ice in the winter. We're going to have a program to try to at least keep our sidewalks clear as best we can. We don't need people slipping and falling. So there we are doing some loss prevention by, salting and clearing walks and things like that. Those are loss prevention techniques. Separation for liability is also usually not possible. So for separation, we were talking from the property side. If you have one manufacturing plant producing everything, maybe you should have two and spread it out so that if you have a fire, your business income risk is lower, and then probably your inventory risk is lower, and your building damage risk is probably lower. At some scale, it might make sense to consider that. A small manufacturer, probably it's never going to make sense to consider that. So you can start to see the limits of separation as a risk control technique. But for liability, it's usually not possible. Okay, so now you manufacture in two locations. That doesn't reduce your liability risk at all. In fact, it might even increase it because now you have two premises exposures that you have to deal with. So separation usually on the liability side isn't something that helps us. It's really loss prevention and loss reduction that we're focusing on. Okay, so for commercial liability risk control, we're trying to control the events that lead to losses. A lot of times that requires some investment, and if it's going to cost anything at all, you're going to need management to buy into this as something that's worth doing. If you can present this as a cost-saving measure, that's an advantage, and that'll make it more likely for people to buy in. But a lot of the savings is going to be unobservable. So one thing to think about, we're skipping ahead here, but let's think about workers' compensation losses. People get hurt on the job. Well, people who are in better physical shape maybe get hurt less often. So we'll institute a wellness program, right? And a really common way to do that is you'll issue everybody a Fitbit and you'll set goals for them. And then if the whole workforce, a certain percent of the whole workforce, 80% of the workforce can hit their goals, they get some sort of reward. And the idea is we're trying to get healthier people, and that'll reduce the number of injuries. But the problem is you can't quantify that. How many injuries have been prevented by the fact that you have this wellness program? You'll never know. So with the wellness program, you're taking it on faith that your investment in this program is saving you money, but you don't know. You can't prove it. And it's interesting, even the academic studies that are out there show considerable disagreement about whether or not wellness programs are worth it. It depends on who you ask. It's an argument, and it's a belief. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. But there's also nothing wrong with the people who say, well, now, wait a minute, we really don't have evidence that we're actually saving money by doing this wellness program. And that's because your savings is completely unobservable. How many, the way I presented in my employee benefits classes, how many heart attacks have you prevented? Well, you don't know. But I know if I prevented one, that it's been worth it because of the amount of savings. Now, there we're talking about healthcare expenditure savings, which is a little bit different than liability risk. The idea that somebody's going to sue us because they got hurt on the job, that's not usually a wellness program kind of thing. I'm just pointing out that some of the things you're going to do are going to face some of the same challenges in that you cannot quantify exactly whether or not you're going to save money. You really do need management to buy in and to take it on faith that the things you're doing are reducing liability. So, there's things you can do. I think about our family business, the propane business. One of the most dangerous places you have is when a person runs out of gas. When you have an interruption in the gas supply, when you restart that, that's a dangerous process. So anytime somebody runs out of gas, one of our policies always was you do a leak check. You put gas into the system, you close it off at both ends, and you wait, and you make sure the pressure is maintained. And if you're losing pressure, that means you got a leak somewhere in the system. While you're out of gas, that's a great time to test for leaks. And so every time somebody ran out of gas, we had to do the leak check. It took a little bit of extra time. We never charged for it, right? Because your customer is going to say, well, I don't want to pay for that. Don't do it. And then something's going to happen on their place. They're going to have an explosion. And who are they going to blame? Yeah, they're going to blame you. You're better off building that into the rest of your costs and saying, hey, we do leak checks at no charge, than you are saying, hey, for $49.95, we'll come out and do a leak check. Did you want us to do that? And then they have an accident and you say, oh, well, you signed something saying you didn't want us to do a leak check, so that's on you. It's a matter of opinion, I'll admit that. But I think you're better off being proactive in that sense. And it really is a liability risk control measure. It costs something. But if you can prevent an explosion, we've never had an explosion in 30 years, longer, 60 years. So it's easy for the people in our area to say, oh, come on, why do we need to do this? This isn't going to happen anyway. We've been fortunate that that's not happened, not only to our company, it hasn't happened anywhere in Southeast Minnesota that I was aware of for 60 years. The problem is it only has to happen once, and when it does, you're probably going to be looking at $1 million loss, and probably more. If somebody dies as a result, it's going to be a lot more than that. So how much are you willing to invest to prevent that? If you could prove that you're preventing that, you'd be willing to invest a lot. The problem is you can't prove it. Propane is actually a fairly safe gas as far as that goes. I don't mean to get too far down the rabbit hole here, but it is safer than natural gas in terms of its ignition temperatures. It's harder to get a propane explosion than it is to get a natural gas explosion. There's less of the energy stored in the equivalent volume, so there's less explosive force. So it's a little bit safer from that perspective, but there's still the possibility that something can go badly, badly wrong. So you're thinking about, okay, how do we prevent this? And to come back to my original point, a leak check for everybody who runs out of gas. It's expensive. You're paying people to do it. It's also probably worth it if it's preventing the possibility of an explosion. So that's just one technique. Although you're going to need management buy-in, and it's going to be hard to present that as cost saving. It's more about, look, we don't want our customers to get hurt. That's reason enough. We don't need to quantify the reason to do it. But you do need management to buy into liability risk control to do it to begin with. And it's interesting when you see how commercial liability is being managed. You've got about half the companies that have decided we need a specific risk management department to look at this kinds of stuff. And then you've got the other half of companies that are saying, no, we don't need a special risk management department. What we need is people who really understand the processes to do their own risk management to try to prevent loss events. Unfortunately, it's usually not until you see something happen that people say, oh, wow, we got to make sure this doesn't happen again. So the history of losses is a lot of times where this comes from, or competitors' losses. Wow, we saw that this happened at somebody else's place. We don't want that to happen to us. What do we do? Same thing with near misses. Oh my goodness, did you see what happened? That could have been so bad. We are very lucky that it wasn't. How do we make sure that never happens again? Unfortunately, the problem that you have there is because of the one, right? You've got the problem of the very first. You don't have a history to point to that or a near miss to point to that. It just happens. And those are extremely difficult losses to manage because of that. And then on the managing claims side, there might be something you can do as well. So the people who've been affected, what can you do to reach out to them to try to limit the losses and do the right thing? See, when people sue, they usually do that out of emotion. So if you can acknowledge that you've done something wrong, and here's the tricky part, as soon as you acknowledge you've done something wrong, a lot of companies are worried about doing that because to them, then they're admitting liability. We're starting to see laws get put into place in states, apology laws, that say by themselves an apology is not an admission of liability. And what that allows people to do is to reach out and say, hey, I'm really sorry this happened. What can we do to try to make it right, without automatically opening themselves up to liability? And then that can diffuse tension. It can reduce the possibility of a lawsuit. And maybe we can handle this outside of courts, because courts are an expensive way to settle disputes. There's no question about that. So if you can be proactive and say, yeah, we've damaged you, there's no question. Let us take care of that and do the right thing. Don't make your customers go to court and fight over every last penny over what you owe them. It might be a smarter strategy to be proactive, reach out and say, I'm really sorry this happened. What can we do to make it right? And then if you can satisfy their demands, if they're reasonable demands, okay, we're at a place and our actions created a fire. Well, yeah, we're going to have to pay for that. And rather than make somebody go to court, now they're angry because you've introduced a delay into the process, and they get mad. And now they want to sue. Now they don't just want recompense for the damage. They want punitive damages. Plus you have to defend in court, and that's expensive. So there's an element here that says, well, can we manage claims by acknowledging that, yeah, we had a responsibility here and we have to do something about that. Yep, it sounds like it's risky to do that. And it's maybe easier for me to talk about this as a small business person because you're active in the community. Everybody knows everybody. It would be unthinkable if we made a mistake to just ignore it and tell the person, sue us. That would be a terrible strategy. They're going to tell everybody. It's a community where everybody knows everybody. You can't get away from responsibility when something happens. And you shouldn't be looking to do that, in my opinion. Businesses get bigger. They start to worry a little bit about, well, are people out there? Are they always honest? Are they going to try to take advantage? And that's reality. So it is probably different for a small business person to evaluate these kinds of things on the managing claims side than it is for the big businesses. What about your premises, the things that happen on your premises? What can you do? And then out of your operations, the things that you routinely do in the course of business, how can you limit liability? There's some obvious areas. You've got some dangerous areas on your premises. Any manufacturing has got machinery. You probably want to keep the general public away from that. So restricting customer access, you don't want a customer just wandering into a dangerous place where they could get hurt. So those doors should be secured. And maybe even a step further, you can't even get into them unless you have a badge or a pass or a card, something, it could be automatic, or you could, in some situations they'll have, I don't want to call them security guards, but that's what they really are. They're making it so that people who don't have authority to be in certain areas can't be there. And it's for their own safety. It's not that we're trying to protect any sort of corporate secrets. We just don't want people getting hurt. If you're going to come in here, you need protective gear. And so, yeah, we're going to post guards by the entrance. Their only job is to make sure that everybody going in there has appropriate protective gear. That's one way to do it. Or if you trust the people individually, you could have an automated system with card passes and card swipes that, yeah, it won't admit a person in unless they've got the card. Obviously, a person with the card could let someone else in, and that's a risk you take. So it depends on the business and the kinds of things, the kinds of dangerous areas that you have. Even in our hardware store, we've got, areas that we kind of blocked off to customers. Like we didn't let them in the area where we're cutting keys. That's not terribly dangerous, but it is a blade that's spinning pretty quickly, and there's just no need to bring another person into that procedure. Same thing with the glass and the screens and anything that involved cutting. We kept customers away from that. Where we filled propane tanks, the barbecue tanks, customers were not allowed to go in there. That's just not a safe place for someone who doesn't know what they're doing. It's not difficult, but it's not something that's intuitive, and it's not something you can figure out on your own. You would never tell your customer, oh yeah, the propane filling equipment is up there, go ahead and fill your tank. You would never do that. You're going to restrict access to dangerous areas. So some of this is obvious. The more of that access you allow, the greater risk for liability, somebody getting hurt. And again, the attorney's question on the other side, number one, is going to be, what were you doing letting them go in there in the first place? They had no business in there, right? Maintenance is often a source of liability. So not just on your premises, but on everything that you own. We'll talk about it again when we talk about vehicles. Things that are poorly maintained can break, and things that break, that's where people get hurt. So maintenance is important. We want to make sure that things are running the way that they should be running. Again, I'm skipping ahead to vehicles, but every day, if you run a truck that carries hazardous materials like propane, you have to have a log, and every day that you drive that vehicle, you have to inspect it. And you have to fill out an inspection sheet and sign it every time you operate that vehicle, every day. Not on the weekends if you're not operating it. But anytime somebody drives that truck, They need to be logging in that they've inspected, everything's right, it's okay. And if anything is wrong, it gets red tagged and it's down and you can't operate it till it's fixed. So you have to make sure that the people who are doing the inspecting are trusted, number one, and number two, protected, that you're not going to punish the people for flagging problems that need to be fixed. The pressure is always, hey, we got to run, we got to go, we got to keep moving, don't worry about it. That's not the attitude that we want to have. We got to have the attitude, hey, no, I found a problem, we got to fix this first. And so that's, otherwise when you're forcing people to rush, that is poor maintenance, and that's how people get hurt. So it's an attitude of taking inspections seriously. And then correcting them, rewarding, not punishing people who identify these things. I, as a propane operator, I don't want to hear that my truck is down. But more than that, I don't want my drivers driving a truck that's dangerous. So I'm always telling them, hey, look, if you find something, let me know. The budget is unlimited here. We're going to fix this. And we need to know, we want everybody safe. So nobody's ever going to be punished for identifying a problem. I can promise you that. Got to get everybody on the right page here so that we can correct things that are dangerous. And again, we talked about appropriate security, especially as it relates to restricting access to dangerous areas. Okay, I'm going to take a break here, and we'll pause, and we'll bring up the rest of liability in the next lecture here. So thanks a lot, you guys. We'll go from there.